Well, hey everybody, this is Chris DeFurio with Keys to the Shop, and welcome to another edition of Shift Break. Now, today's episode is brought to you by our friends at La Marzocco, lamarzocousa.com. You can find out more information also by talking to their sales folks, info at lamarzocousa.com. They have been just making the best espresso machines for almost 100 years. Since 1927, handmade in Florence to this day. Their products are what kind of keep our cafes going. You know, the Linea is the classic that we all kind of grew up with, and then you've got like the KB90 espresso machine, very technologically advanced, scales drip tray. You've got the portafilters that are straight-in locking portafilters for ergonomics, and you have a lot of different espresso machines and espresso equipment built around the idea of ergonomics, flow, and addressing the issues that operators tell La Marzocco, hey, these are things that matter to us, and we are serving people coffee. We want this to be successful, and that's what they're trying to do, is work with cafes and get feedback from them to develop equipment that just works well, is dependable, beautiful, innovative, just a great trifecta right there in La Marzocco. So if you're looking for an espresso machine, or espresso grinders and things like that, you need to go to lamarzocousa.com and check it out. I mean, this is one of the things that you should just start with, honestly. Very dependable and innovative, beautiful machines. What more do you want? So again, lamarzocousa.com. Now, we also are sponsored today by our friends at rattleware.com. Now, they have at Rattleware for a long time been functioning in the background of a coffee shop to help them function. Smallwares are a big deal because if they don't work, then you basically eventually can't work, right? Because a pitcher, a knockbox, a whisk, etc., spoons, these things need to just be there to function so that the big picture can be accomplished. And Rattleware is all about being that supporting actor in the coffee shop. So if you're looking for smallwares, which I'm not sure any coffee shop that's not looking for smallwares, go to rattleware.com, seek out what you need, and you will not be sorry that you did. Okay. So rattleware.com. Now, today's episode is basically a question. It's a question that I think needs to be asked every single time whenever you think about a role that you've put into the business. And I ask people this who I interview when I go to do cafe assessments, or I do a conversation, or I have a conversation at Coffee Fest with people who are having issues with delegation. We did a delegation workshop at Coffee Fest Orlando this past weekend. And this question is, how do you know if you're doing a good job? Now, you can ask that question around having a coffee shop. For example, we had an episode where we talked about how you can be the best, quote unquote, coffee shop. And the answer is not so simple. Of course, it's more about taking the feedback of your community and figuring out, are you accomplishing your goals? Are you fulfilling the needs? Are you surprising people when delighting them and fulfilling what delighting them with surpassed expectations? There's lots of things that go into the business, the coffee shop itself. How is a coffee shop successful? But what about the people in the training positions or the leadership positions like shift leads and managers and operations managers? And I find that most people just don't know what it looks like to walk away from that job and say, I did a good job. I know because here's the standard. Here's what I'm supposed to produce, right? Here's what this, how do I identify that I did a good job? Yeah, honestly, if no one's complaining, then maybe I'm doing a good job. If I'm not getting chewed out by my boss, if my boss is not disappointed in me or coaching me to get better at something, right? Then maybe I'm good enough to not have attracted the ire or the angst or the correction from people around me, right? I'm not hearing complaints from my baristas and I'm not getting grumblings from my managers, then I'm fine, right? But life is not just about avoiding negative things. It's also about championing positive things. Figuring out how to identify the positive product of your work is what is a more sustainable feedback loop than simply trying to not get negative stuff. Because at the end of the day, if you just focus on what you're not getting, and in other words, I'm not getting bad things, you're still kind of empty. Now, you could be doing a good job and you don't even know it. Well, there's no point in it then, is there? Because you can't really use that as as a means to shut yourself down at the end of the day. So you bring your work home. You're always on call. You are the owner, the operator, the manager, whatever you are, because you don't know how to identify whether or not you've accomplished something great in that day or good, or the next step in a process that you can trust, then you can't trust that you've done enough. And so you always have to do more. This is how managers get themselves in trouble. We rely on going above and beyond often because we don't like to define success. That's the problem with above and beyond. But it's also something that you need to think about when it comes to job descriptions and being protective over the manager's time and definitions of what leads to success, to ask, what is a good job look like? So when I talk to a manager of a cafe and I ask them, well, how do you know that you're doing a good job? Well, people are happy. And I think that's pretty much it. You take it day by day. I try to put out fires, make everybody happy. Well, that is a very stressful position to be in because people's happiness is not solely dependent upon you. But if your only metric for whether you're doing a good job is if people are happy, and you somehow don't realize that they also have a home life and an inner life and a personal life and all that affects them, then you're going to think that their happiness is actually up to you. Now, at work, as much as you can do and what you should do, and there's boundaries to that, it's reasonable for you to do as much as you can do. But past that, it's not reasonable for you to try to just fall on the sword all the time and sacrifice your own personal health and well-being to try to make up for something that actually is beyond that boundary of professional, right? So we end up really counting on people to traverse that boundary, to go past that boundary in order to make the place work, when what we should be doing as bosses is providing very clear definitions and clear direction of what a manager's role is, what the schedule looks like, what the delivery of energy and presence looks like week per week, and also providing positive feedback about what we see working and why that feedback is important. Is now the manager can more readily see it for themselves even before you point it out. So you need to point out, say, you did a great job in this way because it produced this thing. The staff all look like they're very confident behind the bar because they were in a rush and it looked so clean. They had their heads up. They were actually talking to customers, producing great drinks. I noticed that. That's a product of good training. And also, what about a product of good leadership in the one-on-ones that you've been tirelessly taking on? If the boss sees you doing that and notices that the people feel a little bit more at ease, or they trust one another more, there's more communication behind the bar. Now, that's a feedback thing that you need to see, because sometimes you're in the weeds and you can't see it yourself. What does it look like to do a good job? That's one of the things. One of dozens of different points that once you become the manager of managers or a leader of leaders, it's your job to help point those things out to those leaders, to show them the forest for the trees. You've given them a responsibility and delegated to them to be in the mix of it. Now, when you remove yourself from that, you have the margin left over from not being in that mix to then curate the experience for that manager and show them what they may miss because they're in that work, right? We always talk about how I want to work on the business, not in the business. Well, the business is your people. So if you want to work on your people, and well, it sounds weird, but part of working on your business is using that perspective that you've gained through delegation to help other people gain a knowledge of the success of their work through pointing it out, through clear definitions, job descriptions, schedules, where they're doing great work, how to notice that great work more readily. And on top of that, coaching them, of course, on things that may still need to have more skill. And they might need more skill in scheduling or inventory or in interpersonal communication and that kind of stuff. But there has to be a what does good look like definition for them to see that they've actually accomplished the goal of their work. Okay. Without that, it just blends into this whole amorphous, this weight that is just on us. And that's where burnout comes from. It's this lack of clarity, lack of communication, and a refusal to focus on identifying the positive things as a means of motivation, and we rely instead upon avoiding the negative things as a means of motivation. That is definitely not sustainable. Been there, done that. And so I would encourage you, define what good looks like. Define what does it mean to do a good job as a manager. Do this for your managers. Do this for the people that you delegate any kind of authority to in the mix of the business. Create these systems as a form of care for these people. And as you care for your people more, you scale. I mean, when you scale, you actually have to grow your capacity to invest more into the relationships more than anything else. That, I think, is probably one of the biggest downfalls of coffee shops and scaling, is that we start to develop systems as a means to pull us away from relationships, as a back door to try to get out of having to talk to people. Just follow the manual, just talk to the checklist, not to me, that kind of stuff. It's the opposite. And we wonder why our experiences feel so hollow. It's because the people that are running these things are not being filled. They feel hollow, they're running on fumes, and it's because the relational component is not being invested into, and clarity of communication and what doing a good job looks like is really one of the cornerstones of that. So that's what I wanted to talk about. I hope that's meaningful to you. And of course, if you have any questions or comments, you can always email chris@keystotheshop.com. Stay tuned for a webinar coming up from Keys to the Shop on principles for cafe success. That's our first webinar offering. For just $99 per person. We're launching that in December, but you're going to see that on Instagram and elsewhere. But I'm excited about that. And I'm just excited that you decided to join me today. So wherever you are in the world and in coffee, I thank you. Hope you have a great one. And we'll see you here next week for another edition of Shift Break from Keys to the Shop.